Thank you, Julian, and thank you, Lloyd, for the invitation to come, and thanks all of you for being here. Now, I'm going to talk to you tonight about urban landscapes of early medieval Italy, and I want to think about how the shapes of houses and the concepts of home and household, specifically around household economies, changed in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. And I'm going to do that by looking at both the built environment and the unbuilt environment. That is, what was planted, what was left open, what was backfilled within cities, in order to try to provide a new view about a new view onto the major transformations of the post-Roman world, which took place between late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, and fundamentally what those changes meant to the people who were living through them. Now, people in this room, I'm certain, are aware and abreast of a lot of the recent scholarship that's been trying to understand the fall of Rome and the formation of post-Roman societies in the West, and the different lenses that people have used to try to understand these changes. So I'm thinking about migration and Peter Heather's work on migration. I'm thinking about Brian Ward Perkins and his Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization, and the different meters that he used to try to tease out the chronology and the motivations that prompted the formations of the post-Roman kingdoms of the West. And I'm thinking also about Chris Wickham and Michael McCormick and their work on the economies of the Mediterranean and how those changed at the end of antiquity. I am working at a slightly different angle on some of the same problems. And for the past few years, I've been working on cultivation in urban contexts, mostly productive cultivation, that is, growing food, not growing ornamental gardens, but growing food. And I've been doing this in order to try and generate some new data with which to evaluate these big transformations. So let me give you an example of the kind of thing I've been working on. Here's one. So this is a document that's preserved in the original from the 8th century in Lucca. So it's preserved in Lucca, and it's a document from Lucca. And I've excerpted the kind of relevant bits that I want to talk about here. It's a property transaction, it's a sale that Auerpert the cleric sells to Jordanus, a venerable man, priest, his house, which is located inside the city of Lucca with its lot, probably meaning the curtilage, that is the land right around the base of the house, a garden and a well that's located near San Giorgio. On one side of the property is the land of Raduald the notary, bounded with a hedge, and at the far end is a lot of Berruciones Berlongones, and on the other side is Memoranius's garden. As I said, a house with a lot, land, garden or well, and everything which is seen in them, wholly to me, no authority is retained. So this is a completely conventional 8th century property document for early medieval Italy. We have thousands of them preserved in contemporary documents, and we have another 1,000 or so that are preserved in cartulary copies that are recorded later. They come from all over the Latin-speaking parts of the Italian peninsula. They're based mostly on late Roman formulae for property transactions, with some modifications depending on Lombard law or Byzantine law or Carolingian law once we get into the Carolingian kingdom. So this is an entirely conventional property transaction. And here we are, I'm showing you here just a sort of view into the archives in Lucca. We have such great documentation from Lucca because the Archiepiscopal Archive preserved these documents in the original in situ. And here's a map of Lucca, and here's the San Giorgio that we're talking about, and the garden that's in this document must be located somewhere right around here. And as you'll recall from the text of the document, the boundaries were specified by the neighboring properties, and among the neighboring properties were other cultivated spaces. So we have to think about this as a cluster of houses with gardens located inside the walled city of early medieval Lucca. I mean, this is a distinctly urban context. In early medieval Italy, with these thousands of documents that we have, there's never ever any doubt about whether you're talking about an urban context or a rural context. The documents always specify in this city, within these walls, or outside these walls, or in this countryside. And there's different vocabulary to describe different kinds of property. So it's important to recognize that we are dealing with an urban context here, decidedly. And I want to just really flag for you, if it's not clear, how different this is from what happened in the Roman period. So let's look at the Roman context. Now, here I'm showing you a digitized plan of part of Pompeii. And Pompeii is a complicated place to talk about when we're thinking about the cities of Italy. It's not entirely typical. The quality of preservation of the archaeological data is entirely atypical, but we all know the reasons for that. It's more that this is a kind of regional, probably quite workmanlike town. I mean, this might be like Blackpool of the Roman period, rather than the center of Rome or at the center of a sort of major and important and powerful place. That's not to say Blackpool wasn't important, and that's not to say that Pompeii wasn't important either, but we have to calibrate the kind of information that we get. So this is not the center of metropolitan urbanity in the first century. But nonetheless, just looking at the plan, you can get a pretty good sense of how densely built up Pompeii was. And if we look a little bit more in detail at some of the insulae, the blocks, you'll see that the houses were built sort of cheek and jowl. So here we've got the house of the Vestals. It's built up against another house. There's another house located down here. There's a couple of street-fronted bars down below, and a little well and a shrine down at the bottom of the insulae. So there's no green space here. There's no open space apart from the public monumental spaces of the city. If you know, and you probably imagine Roman houses or Roman cities with certain kinds of decorative gardens in them, and there were. But this is where the excavators identified formal gardens in this house, right? Two very, very small sections of what was otherwise a paved house. And these are formal gardens. They are ornamental gardens. What were they for? Decoration, really. When we think about, so there's different ways of measuring this, but when we look at the evidence that we have for urban cultivation in the Roman period, we have overwhelming information about green things. Trees, cypresses, box hedges, myrtle trees, laurel trees, cypresses. Occasionally we get lilies, roses, violets, things like that. But really, the overwhelming majority of the plant life in cities, inside houses, and in the occasional moments where they were in monumental landscapes, was green sort of ornamental hedges and shrubs. 80% of the vocabulary about plant species in Roman horticultural guides is about hedges and shrubs, not celery, not food products, not lettuces, not fruits, and not really even flowers. These were intended to be backdrops for a certain kind of social interaction, for dinner parties, for being seen through a suite of rooms by a visitor to the house. They structured and gave space to a certain kind of social interaction among high and middling status homeowners or people who lived in houses. When we look at the archaeobotany of this particular insula, there's one insula in Pompeii that's been excavated by single context recording relatively recently. So we've got a lot of data about what the archaeobotany of the site was. When we look at the archaeobotany of this insula, we can see quite a lot about what people ate in the productive parts of the houses and in the street fronting bars. And one of the things that's very notable about what we see here is that we've got food stuff. So we've got pine nuts, we've got olive pits, we've got grape pips, we've got fig seeds, we've got grain, your standard wheat grain, as well as barley. But these are all processed elsewhere and brought to the site. So this is not stuff that people are working, that they're picking on site and threshing or picking or processing on site. These are things that they're getting already. It's as though they've got a Waitrose delivery wrapped in plastic already, and it goes directly into the kitchen, or they buy it off the vendor in the bar. If we look elsewhere, we can see some other versions of the same kind of thing. So at Ostia, there are these great tenement blocks that have been called the Casa dei Giardini, or the houses with gardens. This is a reconstruction of one of them from Ostia that was done at the time of the excavation in the 1920s. And you can see it's got planted bits, presumably for the use of the occupants of the tenement. But this is not food producing. This is a certain kind of ornamental garden. And to round out the picture of this, people didn't need to grow food anywhere near their houses because they had street vendors, they had shops where people were selling fresh fruits and vegetables. Now this is a funerary relief, so it's not a snapshot of a street front in Ostia, but it does give a pretty good sense of how this kind of thing worked. Here's a person standing in front of a stall with a table in front of her, and she's got bundles of, she's got what looks like a pumpkin, she's got some figs and maybe some apples. And this seems to be really typical of food sourcing in cities. Street vendors, food hawkers walking the streets, and these sort of temporary market stalls. And there's a big economic system that supported this kind of production, rural production at market scale of foodstuff and places to sell it inside cities. Now, so to sum up, in ancient Italy, food cultivation is intensely, almost exclusively rural. It was symbolically aligned with core and essential values about tradition and social order, and we'll talk about that again in a few moments. Inside city walls, that was the place for civilization, for culture, for order and educated leisure, as well as commercial exchange of lots of things, but also food. In some cases, in some parts of cities, there were ornamental plantings in monumental spaces, that is sort of something like public gardens. So I'm showing you here an artist's reconstruction of the Temple of Peace at the Forum of Peace, which was built in the 1st century in Rome, which was unusual among the major paved monumental fori in the center of town, in that it was clearly planted. And excavators in the 1990s found the bases of these fountains and the roots, the preserved sort of root balls of Rosa Gallica. So this is a very floral, highly scented, bright pink rose that was planted up and down these fountains. This is a very specific representation of the imperial project under Vespasian. Other imperial plantings represented newly conquered territories. So Judea involved the importation of date palms back to the city of Rome. This sort of expression of the territorial conquest of the Roman Empire is played out in the monumental center of the city of Rome. It's also about a very specific kind of leisure and activity. You'll see that there are classicizing statuary around. This is coded to convey and communicate and encourage others to enjoy the splashing of water with the planting of ornamental plants in the context of viewing a certain kind of art. So this is a very normative project about the values of the empire in the 1st century. And there are also, quite famously at Rome, what are known as the horti. Right? You might think, horti, well, those are gardens. Surely those are gardens, and they could even be productive gardens. But there's kind of a joke in the name. in that the hortus of Republican and early imperial Rome is a distinctly unproductive garden. Right? It's like a squandering of an intensely valuable real estate for the purposes of pleasure gardens, which are usually planted with shrubs, trees, and green things, and might have theaters and statue collections in them. It's worth thinking a little bit about how this works in terms of the urban development of the city of Rome. So this is the walls of the city in the Republican period, and all of the light green areas are the Republican period horti, so distinctly outside the walls. The city expands, and then here the walls of Aurelian, which were built in the 3rd century, the latter half of the 3rd century, take this form. And these are what we think are probably the things that appear in our sources as early imperial horti. And they're on the sort of outskirts, within the walls, but on the outskirts, and then here outside the walls of the city. But these are decidedly not productive spaces. There's this real clear divide between productive outside and consumption inside. That's the model of the Roman city. And this structured message of the value of ornamental horticulture and the distinctions between civilized city and uncivilized rural falls apart in late antiquity. This all ends by the 6th century, and it ends probably somewhat even before that. So I'm going to stick with my Roman examples, and I'll take you back to the Forum of Peace here. This is another artist's reconstruction showing the excavated remains. In the 5th and the 6th century, all of those plantings and fountains and roses are gone, and the structures are being used for huts. If we switch to a different kind of property, a house, we can see a similar kind of transformation. So here I'm showing you a house in the Piazza dei Cinquecento, which it was excavated when the Stazione Termini, so when the train station of Rome was being built in the 1930s. So this is a completely typical Roman townhouse of the imperial period. It looks just like Pompeii, the houses in Pompeii, or just like the houses in Milan of the period. The excavations made very clear, however, that in the 5th or 6th, and the chronology is very difficult because the material sciences the material chronological indicators are very difficult to get precision on. Half, or even more than half of the house was backfilled. So you'll see here I don't have a clicker, sorry. Here, yes I do. You can see here that half of the house was blocked off, right? There was a wall that was constructed across here. And this is where the inhabitants of the 6th century lived, facing the street. And this was backfilled. It was backfilled with rubble, it was backfilled with earth, and it became an unbuilt area. Now, nobody did any archaeobotany in the 1930s in this context, so we don't know what was grown there, if anything. It may have been just an enormous pile of rubble. But this kind of thing appears over and over and over again across the cities of Italy, where this material, the backfilled material, is very clearly humic, rich. It's what's often called dark earth. Dark earth is a sort of problematic issue to talk about here. I'd be happy to answer questions about it. I'm going to park it to one side. But what's obvious is that the shape of the house in the city in early medieval Italy, or late antique Italy even, changed. So from being a densely built up house with a bunch of other buildings right next to it, it becomes a lot with a house and an unbuilt space next to it. We can get a sense from the textual sources about what happens here. And I'm going to read out to you, if you'll bear with me, a letter of Gregory the Great, so from the end of the 6th century, who says, so Gregory the Great was the Pope. He had also been the urban prefect of Rome, so he had an enormous administrative responsibility of the city of Rome in different capacities over the course of the end of the 6th century. And his register records in excerpts his letters and correspondence about all kinds of things, including the management of the property of the Roman Church. And we can get a sense of that from here. So Gregory says, for those choosing a religious vocation, we should take care, with suitable consideration, that the occurrence of some hardship neither makes them inactive nor undermines the strength, heaven forbid, of their holy way of life. For that reason, we order that with the present authority that you should hand over the following property to the Abbess Flora, with the right of possession for her indubitable ownership. The house is located in this city in the 4th region, next to the place called the White Hands, the property of the Holy Church of Rome, over which we preside with God's authority, and in which a patrician lady, Campana, is known to have once lived. Hand it over with the garden also and the lodgings, which a doorway encloses within the same house. Thus, with Christ's help, the abbess can construct a convent in this house, where she can live with her community so that she, and also her successors in status and position, can possess the above-mentioned house and garden and all things belonging to them, as we've said, with a peaceful and inalienable right, as granted by us due to our respect for her piety. So there's a lot of things going on here, but one of the things that's really, really clear is A, the patrician house owned by the woman Campana is a house plus a garden, plus lodgings, whatever that might be. And Gregory has been left this house by the patrician woman, perhaps as a donation to the Roman Church, and he's redistributing it and allocating it to a community of religious women. So this kind of very small-scale household convent is quite typical. It doesn't get the sort of same glamorous prominence in the development of monasticism as Monte Cassino does, but it's really quite common that these urban houses are given over to communities of men and women, but certainly women. And Gregory does this so that the community can live, so they have a place where they can live, and so that they have no occurrence of hardship. Now, we don't know if the hardship means that they don't have any place to live, or the hardship might mean they don't have any way to grow cabbages. We don't know. He doesn't tell us. But over 4 other documents from Rome, and another from Palermo, and another from Milan, we can see Gregory doing this over and over again with properties that have been left to the Roman Church. He gives houses with gardens to religious communities. So, this is a new world. By the time we get to 600, the cities of Italy. I've been focusing on Rome, but these examples could be multiplied in Naples, in Milan, in Brescia, in Benevento. Across Italy, we can see similar things. Large houses being broken down into smaller bits and other parts being left unbuilt or being cultivated, called gardens and cultivated. Now, on the one hand, you may not at all be surprised to learn that there were gardens in the cities in early medieval Italy. In fact, in this country, we're pretty familiar with this kind of thing happening. In certain circumstances, parts of urban contexts get turned over to food cultivation. So in the First World War, here the gardens of Kensington Palace are turned over to allotments. And famously, in World War II, there's a major government campaign encouraging people to convert parts of their own houses and communal properties to the purposes of growing food. And here we can see something, this is kind of what I think is happening in 6th century Italy. We can see here happening in World War II London, right? A bomb site, a damaged building, instead of rebuilding it, it gets turned into a space for cultivating food for the people who are living nearby. And we might say, quite simply, well, that's the obvious explanation, isn't it? Right? In times of need and want, the value of the property is not as valuable for living as it is for food cultivation. And that's to a certain degree true, but this is something that needs to be interrogated, I think. When did it start? Where? Was there regional variation across the Italian peninsula? What exactly did people grow in their gardens? Who had access to cultivated spaces? And how exactly did this work? So I am going to make the case that while we've known about this evidence, that there was food cultivation, or at least gardening, in early medieval cities, that we need to analyze it further. And I think that what we should do with it is reconfigure our understanding of medieval cities, to acknowledge that the unbuilt parts of the city were as critical to the workings of power and of status as the buildings were. And we've got really, really good methodological frameworks for understanding how power works in terms of building a church, or dedicating resources to the construction of a new church with a particular type of shape, or a particular dedication to a certain kind of saint, or where a house is built and what it should be and what it's made of. Those are tools that we use for analyzing the workings of power in early medieval cities. I think we need to use the same kinds of tools to investigate the workings of power around unbuilt elements, and I'm speaking specifically here about productive gardening. And that this was not simply a matter of straitened circumstances and making do, but it rather constitutes an entirely new set of cultural values and power relations. So, I'm going to be really quick here. Lots of things happened to cause urban cultivation. I'm going to just sum up. You can pick apart any bit of this, but I think on whole it's worth thinking about the complexity of transformations. So from the time of Constantine, it is no longer necessary for senatorial elites to keep a residence in Rome or in Italy. Once the creation of Constantinople happens, there's a sort of drain of resources and wealth away from the Italian peninsula towards Constantinople. The sack of Rome in 410 meant that it was no longer desirable to be in Rome for some people. There certainly is still wealth in Rome in the course of the 5th century, but this is certainly this takes away one of the legs in support of Italian cities, and Rome in particular. And it's worth remembering that the sack of Rome was notable for happening to Rome, but it also affected other cities on the Italian peninsula. The wars that brought about eventually the sack involved the threatening and sometimes the destruction of rural estates all up and down the Italian peninsula, luxury residential buildings in the cities not only of Rome but also Milan, also Ravenna, also other places. It destroyed hectares and hectares of fields and orchards and grapevines and vegetable gardens. So if we're going to use one of those kind of old-fashioned spaghetti maps of the barbarian invasions that had arrows coming in and going out, you would see that there are lots of arrows going in and out of the Italian peninsula over the course of the 5th century, making it not so desirable a place to invest in agriculture if you're the agricultural investing sort, i.e. senatorial class, in the 5th century. The wars, elite relocation, this all meant that Italy's agricultural system wobbled. Market gardening was no longer lucrative. There were fewer people to buy things. Your fields might get burned. Flowers, which was a major crop around cities in the ancient period, were no longer really desirable after Christian churchmen changed their minds about the use of garlands and flowers. They weren't used for temples after the 4th century, and Christian churchmen were pretty sniffy, pardon the pun, about the use of flowers. So flowers tanked, lettuce, cabbages, beans, pumpkins tanked in Italy. And then there are wider changes, of course, across the empire which affect long-distance movement of goods. The Vandal conquest of North Africa. Now, pottery and grain still go from North Africa to Italy over the course of the 5th century after the Vandal conquest, but in diminishing quantities, and probably for payment rather than as part of the tax obligation of the Annona. After the Arab conquest of North Africa in the 7th century, that ceases entirely. Cities in Italy themselves were depopulated, whether by migration, by disease and hunger, or a combination of the two. There are large areas within city walls that are uninhabited, But as I've suggested, when we look really closely at this dishabitation, or the disabitato, if anyone's ever read Krautheimer's Profile of a City, he talks about the disabitato, and he talks about whole areas of the city which are abandoned. But it's not like the whole of Camden was abandoned. It's more like, I've shown you, this is one example, that houses became plots that had land and buildings attached. I'll give you another example of what this looks like from Rome in the 10th century. I'm sorry, Julian asked me if I was going to be talking mostly about Rome, and I said, no, I'll be talking about the whole Italian peninsula, and then here I am using example after example after example from Rome. You'll have to take my word that these kinds of examples can also be teased out from a bunch of other cities in Italy, and we will talk about Naples and Verona in a minute. So here is another one of these documents, this time from the 10th century, that talks about a rental agreement, in this case, between a church of Santa Maria Nova and properties in the center of Rome, and one in particular. It is a 2-storied house with roof tiles, the whole thing with a lower and upper floor up to its roof, with a small courtyard and a pergola and a marble staircase in front of it, with its garden behind it, in which there are olive trees or other fruiting trees, with entrance and exit and with all that pertains to it. It's located in Rome in the 4th region, not far from the Colosseum, in the temple which is called the Romuleum, which is the temple of Venus and Rome. I'll show you in a minute. And between the boundaries from one side, there's the house of Romanus, who's a smith, the house of Franco and Sergio, who are brothers, and the garden of the heirs of Calopetras. On the second side, the garden of Constantius, that's my typo, the garden of Constantius the priest and his associates, and on the third side, the garden of Anna, most noble girl, and the house of Stephen, a bronze worker. And on the fourth side is a public road. So this is where we're talking about. This is the big Hellenistic platform of the Temple of Venus in Rome, which is the Colosseum, is just right over here off screen. And this is the Via Sacra leading up to the Capitolium, and this is the Roman Forum. So we are right smack dab in the center of Rome in the 10th century. The church that owns this plot is Santa Maria Nova. You can see it here. That's the shape of the church right there. And another sort of major church down the road is Santi Cosme e Damiano, which is just right here. What you see in that document, I think, is a neighborhood. And you see a neighborhood of tradesmen, of artisans, really, right? They're known by their trade, smith, bronze worker, this sort of thing. You see a cluster of houses, really quite close to each other, but with bits of unbuilt area between them. Gardens bound the other gardens as well. We've got a woman who has a garden here, whoever Anna, the most noble girl, is. And you can see families passing on their properties, probably passing on their rental agreements of the properties rather than their actual outright ownership of properties, because in Rome, everything is somewhat owned by the church, and that's the case here. The church owns this, and it rents it out for a generation or for 3 generations. So we can really see this community living right next to its landlord, perhaps praying in one of the 2 churches down in the region where people are living, and in proximity to a mix of cultivated and uncultivated spaces in the center of Rome. What did they grow? Well, as you may or may not know, the majority of the center of Rome, just like the majority of Naples and Milan, were excavated in the 19th or early 20th century, which means that we've got very, very little in the way of archaeobotanical information. That's improving. We know more and more, but it's nothing like the kind of density of data that you get here in Britain. But from one of the recent excavations on the Forum of Caesar, so just a bit north of here, this sort of area right about there, you get some archaeobotanical information. So I'm here again showing you an artist's reconstruction of the findings. This is the back of the Senate House, and this is the area of the Forum of Caesar in the 10th century, in which you have a number of houses with cultivated lots next to them, and one really quite substantial garden that we see in the 9th century. There are two phases. In the 9th century, the first phase, in the early 9th century, the pavers of the Forum of Caesar, so the monumental limestone paving of the Forum of Caesar, is lifted up and a garden is created. In the first phase, you get cabbages, lettuces, white mustard, mint, and aniseed. Now, you probably had a bunch of other things, but those are the things that were let go to seed and whose seeds were big enough that they were mineralized in the archaeological record, right? There's some real complexities around how you can find gardens in the archaeological record, because if you do any gardening yourself, you know that you usually pick things before they go to seed, and you don't necessarily let the seeds stay in the soil, because otherwise they're going to sprout again the next year, and you may not want them to sprout there. You may want to move them somewhere else. So it's under really quite extraordinary circumstances do you get mineralized seeds preserved in the archaeological record, but we do from some bits of this. But what we've got here is a range of species, in this case mostly green stuff. And then in the middle of the 9th century, the ground level is raised. So a new layer of soil is brought in, a huge amount of compost is brought in, and rows of grapevines are planted 5 meters apart with coriander and celery in between them. And then you get big fruit trees there. You get quite a lot of fig, cherries, plums, and hazelnuts, in addition to the grapevine and the greens. So the excavators hypothesized about the scale of production here. So the excavated area measured about 1,000 square meters. If it included the entire area that's now under a main road and that we don't know about of the Forum of Caesar, it could have got to as big as 2,000, 2,500 square meters, about 1,000 of which was vine and the rest was orchard. Now, I did a little calculation about what the courtyard out here at Burlington House is, and that's almost exactly 1,500 square meters. So we're talking about a garden that's 1.5 times the size of that courtyard outside. Sizable, right, bigger than my back garden at home, but not a farm. Not any kind of industrial scale or market scale production. And it's really worth stressing that. We've got quite a lot of species from these two different phases. No one is specializing in onions or grape here. This is household scale productivity. A very large household, that's for sure, but household scale production. There are calculations that you can use to figure out about how much wine you can make from 1,000 square meters of vineyard in the ancient world. And the estimate is that that's about 200 to 250 liters of wine per annum. So that won't get a Cambridge College very far, I can assure you. This is really not a huge amount that's being produced. We have to think about this as a house. Again, large house, but a house. This whole system of houses with gardens ends in the 11th century in Italy. This large vineyard in the Forum of Caesar was replaced with a neighborhood of about 5 houses lining a road. And if you think about going and visiting cities in Italy, you think about perhaps those tower houses, medieval tower houses that are fronting streets. That's what comes in the 11th century. So you stop getting houses which are on lots with gardens attached to them, and you start getting houses which are built close up to each other, and you start getting market scale production in the countryside outside Italy, Italian cities again. The rise of the communes, the commercial revolution, all of these sort of things that happen for various complicated reasons in the 11th century, but they all spell the end of this phenomenon that I'm identifying here. So I'm going to get to that in a minute. What are the economic and social implications of these households? I want us to think about them and how they relate to ideas of agriculture and how this changed in the period between antiquity and the early Middle Ages. And so I'm going to have to take a step back into the Roman period, briefly. So in Roman society, there was quite a lot of cultural esteem that was assigned to growing things well. Despite, or perhaps because of the fact that very few people in the Roman world had ever touched a garden tool, there was a whole array of positive values that were attached to agrarian pursuits. And if you've read Virgil, you know this immediately. So Nicholas Purcell, who's a Roman historian, says, deep in what the Romans thought about themselves, we find intensive horticulture and the lots on which it took place, and the domestic nature of those lots is central. So being able to produce useful crops, as well as ornamental plants that were a source of pleasure, this was a source of ethical virtue and wealth in the Roman world. There's poetry, there's prosaic agronomic texts with instructions and guidelines about how to do this. There are architectural treatises about how the architecture around gardens should be created. Roman authors fostered an appreciation for working the land, not just for the decoration in townhouses, but also because there was beauty and pleasure in the cultivation, proper cultivation, efficient cultivation of plants and trees. Thinking and writing about gardening fed into the so-called myth of the peasant patriarch, which is something deep, deep, deep back in Roman self-mythology. The ideal of Rome's traditional leaders as men who worked their land, and texts about agriculture, which celebrated the religious duties and ethics. Discussions of gardens could also promote the virtues of Roman military expansion. So we talked for a second about palms being brought back from Judea. We could also think about how Columella's treatise on agriculture uses a discussion of the planned gardens of Italian villas, rural estates, as a device to describe the geographic variety that imperial period expansion afforded the Italian consumer. Right, so the discussion of all the different kinds of lettuces which come from all the different parts of the Mediterranean that have been conquered by the Romans in the first century feeds into this agricultural treatise. Now, quite a lot of these classical agronomic texts survived into the Middle Ages, but they weren't particularly widely copied or circulated until the later Middle Ages. In the 3rd and the 4th and the 5th centuries, so in late antiquity, as the fields of Italy are burning in the latter half of that period, writers produced new texts, compiling and extracting bits from earlier ones. And these kind of extracted versions or excerpted versions had a lot wider circulation than their earlier counterparts. So Palladius, who's writing probably in the late 4th century, that was composed almost entirely out of extracts from Columella, from Gargulius Marcialis, and from an epitome of Vitruvius, which were kind of reshuffled and repackaged as a month-by-month guideline of what you do in order to have a fruitful and efficiently cultivated estate. And that text was circulated and recopied quite widely in the early Middle Ages. These cultural attitudes to agriculture underwent two transformations at the end of antiquity. They aren't sort of unidirectional or unilateral, and so different places and different people had different ideas, and the changes occurred differently in different places. But nonetheless, I want to interrogate how the world of the mind played a role in reshaping this material and practical aspect of early medieval cities. In particular, how traditional values of self-sufficiency and efficient agricultural production took on new significance as religious houses, like bishops and their houses and monasteries, took on responsibilities for charitable feeding, as well as the support of dedicated religious men and women and other dependents. So, the connection between gardens and the dedicated religious was, on the one hand, very practical, as we saw in the example from Gregory the Great in his giving of a house with a garden to a bunch of women. But it's actually much deeper than that. It's at the heart of some of the most influential thinking about Christian life, because the Garden of Paradise, Eden, where both flowers and edible fruits grew, was of course the site of man's fall. So Augustine, in his Confessions, written at the end of the 4th century, writes of his own conversion to the dedicated religious ascetic life, which happened under a fig tree in an urban garden in Milan. He heard a voice coming from a neighboring garden, which persuaded him to take up a dedicated religious life. The Greek life of a 4th century Egyptian ascetic Pachomius describes Theodore, who was Pachomius' disciple, who set out a monastic life in his garden. And that Greek life of Pachomius was incredibly influential among late Roman thinkers about how they should set up new ways of living a dedicated religious and ascetic life. And the provision for food was central to this. So if in ancient literature and in ancient cities, gardens and cultivated spaces were places of leisure, of otium, in late antique religious communities, they were decidedly not. Church fathers were generally averse to traditional forms of leisure and pleasure in this world, and certainly among communities of dedicated religious. So you will no doubt recall the chapter 48 of the Rule of Benedict, which says that leisure, or idleness, is the enemy of the soul. And among guidance to early religious communities, there's a consistent intent to provide gardens for men and women living together for the purposes of devotion to God. And they are clearly food-producing kitchen gardens. So the Rule of the Master, which is an anonymous rule composed in the early 6th century, says that all that's necessary must be contained within a monastery's walls, including an oven for bread and a garden. Benedict's rule, written about 535, which follows very closely the Rule of the Master, specifies that the location of the monastery should have water, a garden, a mill, and all which is necessary so that the monks are not obliged to go outside the community to meet their needs. Compositions such as these Italian rules tend to imply rural settings for religious communities, but that is no doubt what was behind Gregory's thinking when he allocated these houses in Rome and in Milan and in Palermo. In the period up to the 6th century, models of asceticism and communal living among the dedicated religious evolved new theologies and practices to resolve changing ideas and different circumstances. And the teachings of agronomy and estate management informed the decision, not only about monasteries, but also about the households of other churchmen. Benedict, Cassiodorus, Augustine, Gregory, and several others who composed rules for ascetic life, they were all aristocratic men of high social standing with a classical paideia, which included the books, poems, images that esteemed and valued agriculture and estate management. The discourse of how to manage an estate and a household proved directly influential, not only to monastic thinkers, but also to bishops of late antiquity, who developed strategies to run their households and who provided models for subordinate priestly households. Oikonomia was a specialized branch of practical knowledge and personal ethics in antiquity. Vitruvius, the architectural theoretician, provided 6 principles desirable in architectural design, the last of which was oikonomia. And in late antiquity, this oikonomia idea fed into emerging ideas about the practice of power and stewardship within ecclesiastical households. Now, Christina Sessa, who's a historian of late antique religion, has made the case that the paradigm of good estate management and the provision of welfare for dependents was critical to the shaping of the role of the Bishop of Rome between the 4th and the 6th century. So in that transition from the person in Rome being just the Bishop of Rome to being the Pope, something bigger than the city of Rome. Sessa argued that to lead the church, bishops had to be seen as expert estate managers, men who could be trusted with the orderly and ethical oversight of people and property. Her argument locates one branch of the authority of churchmen in Italy in a role which drew upon the roles of paterfamilias, so male head of household. In the changing social orders of late antiquity, the responsibilities of leadership incumbent upon the paterfamilias endured as a role for high-status men, but was complicated by high-status men taking on religious responsibilities. The other branch of authority that was invoked in this rhetorical discourse among churchmen was that of the steward. This is a role that went by many names in late antiquity, and fundamentally, these were the guys who acted as agents of landowners, the dominus of the estate, to oversee finances, personnel, and other management duties related to agricultural land and its productivity. In late antiquity, activities of stewardship and the practice of oikonomia developed as a political philosophy. We looked at the case of Gregory the Great and his allocation of a patrician woman's home to a community of nuns. I'm going to sort of fast forward in time and look at two further examples of the ways in which gardens and households related to new ideas of stewardship. And in these ideas, we can see that houses with gardens were economically valuable, but they were also extremely valuable as social tools. So one example is here in Naples. I promised we would get to Naples. Keep good to my word. This is a document from the 10th century that records a donation of Maru and her daughter Barbaria of a property to a church. So Maru and Barbaria, the nun, mother and daughter, for the redemption of their souls, give to their own church, that is probably the church that their family has created, of Santa Eufemia, Martyr of Christ, which is located in the region Dos Amantes, near the public wall, an entire garden located in front of the church with trees, a pool, and all that pertains to it, which is adjacent on the eastern side to the garden of Dominus Anastasius, the prefect, to the garden Maria, sister and aunt of them, and on the other side to the west, a road which runs from the public wall up to the entrance to the church and to this garden, and to the entrance to the garden of Johannes Esauri on the south end, adjacent to the garden of Johannes and Gregorius Esauri, and also the garden of Johannes, son of Stephanus the Tribune. And on the other end, to the north, the church in the garden of Johannes, son of Elias, now deceased. Likewise, we offer another garden, which is next to the communal pool, which is with its entrance and all that pertains to it. It's held that it is held that in all the days of their lives, this mother and daughter have the usufruct of these things, and both or whichever of them survives the other, likewise from that point, should do so or decide in her power. So again, entirely conventional 10th century document that we've got here. The pools are probably cisterns. These aren't swimming pools, and they're probably not fountains. In fact, they're assuredly not fountains. They're cisterns for irrigation or for household water use. And the trees that are being referred to here are probably not cypresses, but they're probably fruiting trees. Now, what's going on here is a pro anima donation. Right? This is very, very typical in the Middle Ages. This is someone who gives a gift to an ecclesiastical institution on behalf of their souls. They say this, for the redemption of their souls. But what they're also doing is keeping the use of these properties for their entire lifetime. So that means they have a place to garden during their lifetime, but the church becomes keenly interested in making sure that everything is looked after on that property, because it's eventually going to come to them. The monastery is the designated beneficiary, and they want to look after it. They are now in a mutually obligatory relationship around this piece of property. It's also really worth noting that there's quite a lot of neighbors that have the same name, Esauri, Esauri, Esauri. These are women of the Esauri family. So this is a cluster of property that this family owns in Naples, of cultivated property in Naples. And the signatories of this document, which I haven't preserved here, but the sister and aunt, so Maria, is one of the signatories, and Johannes Esauri is also a signatory on this property, meaning that the family is looking out for this widow and her daughter by making sure that this cultivated space is also being looked after by the monastery. So here we can see the formation of social bonds which are going to last beyond the lifetime of the people involved in cultivating the onions or the cabbages that they're growing year in, year out. And I'm going to show you one further example here. Here's a map of Naples, and here's where that garden is located, in Church of Santa Eufemia there. I'm going to show you one other example, which is a really clear example of power and how these gardens relate to power relationships. This is a document from, it's the British Library, but it's a document from Verona, from King Berengar, who was trying to be the emperor of Italy in the end of the 9th and beginning of the 10th century. And what Berengar does is give a little land located inside the arena, not far from the castle of Verona, so it's part of the theatre of Verona, in which he gives a house that's in the vaults of the cavea of the theatre and a piece of the orchestra of the theatre of Verona. And he gives it to his chamberlain, John the cleric and our chamberlain, to have and to hold and exchange and alienate whatever his soul might choose, whatever he wished to do, without intervention from public powers. Berengar does that with a couple of other properties in this area of the arena and of the castrum in the city of Verona. Now, this is an area that's been understood as the royal seat of power since the 4th century at Verona. And so what Berengar is doing is giving away parcels of fiscal property that's owned by the kingdom, to his supporters as a way of ensuring their allegiance in a contested moment about leadership in the Kingdom of Italy. And he does this through a piece of property that includes a cultivated space. Now, it's clearly in the theatre because it's in the cavea of the theatre. It's not a large parcel of property. It doesn't involve a considerable income, but it's enormously prestigious because of its location and because of its ability to provide for the household of the chamberlain. And what Johannes does with it is create a xenodocium with it. This is a 19th century drawing of the theatre of Verona and the church of San Siro, which was built out of the property that John the Chamberlain acquired from Berengar and created it and dedicated to a religious institution upon his death in the 10th century. So, what I think is at stake here in this example, but in these wider examples, is that we have accepted a grand narrative of the early medieval city, which runs something like this. There's a vibrant state-encouraged or private enterprise-motivated economy of the Roman period, which diminished with eastward relocation of the imperial seat and the dissolution of imperial administration in the west. Plague, poverty, reduced urban populations of the 6th and the 7th centuries to fractions of what they had been in antiquity. And those poor people who were left they were forced to fend for themselves in muddy, decaying, decrepit, mostly abandoned cities. The population uptick, the territorial reorganization at the end of Carolingian rule, the rise of communes in the 11th century, all of this permitted the restoration of a clear divide between urban, mercantile civilization and rural agriculture. As with all grand narratives, there are elements of this picture which are demonstrably correct. But what I'd like to point out today is the way in which this narrative demotes the development of urban gardening as a subsistence-level reflex, rather than a deliberate and organized shift in production. And I think that these transformations are not simply a collapse into poverty and squalor, but they are a specific and deliberate shift made according to and promoting new values and responding to new realities. So we can begin now to see the way in which urban landscapes of Italy changed. They became greener, just as the food on the table in Italy became decidedly more local. The means by which people fed their families changed, so that the relationships between one's townhouse and one's relatives and one's access to cultivated spaces changed too. People's views on horticulture and households and their responsibilities also changed towards a world in which practical agricultural knowledge was transmitted, often within the context of religious houses. The nature of domestic space was no longer one in which leisure entailed dining on food brought from villas or admiring classical statuary or roses. People probably still enjoyed their dinners, People probably also admired art in this period, but the structural apparatus for that kind of behavior no longer existed. Instead, cultural value and social value were found in having cultivated spaces and presumably working them, although we don't know very much about who actually worked in any of these spaces, in making food for the household and exchanging it between households. Productive spaces were tools for building social relationships on the terms of obligation and prestige. They were also key for storing up assets in heaven by putting these resources in the hands of religious communities. And through the transformations of antiquity and the early Middle Ages, urban living took on new forms, and urban horticulture played a key role in that. Thank you.